Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. Today on the show, I am joined by the New York-based artist and writer Justin Beal. Late last year, Justin's first book, Sandfuture, was published by MIT Press, and it was, and I say this without exaggeration, not only probably my favorite book of 2021, but also one of the best books about architecture and design that I've read in a long, long time. When I wrote my write-up of the best books of the year for Eye on Design last month, Sandfuture was the first one that I knew needed to be included. It's a book that's hard to describe, as you'll hear in this conversation. To put it simply, it's a book about the architect Minoru Yamasaki, the Japanese-American architect likely most well known for designing the World Trade Center Twin Towers that were hit on September 11th. But this is not a book about September 11th, and it's not even just a biography of Yamasaki. Written in a fragmentary style, Justin mixes anecdotes from Yamasaki's life with moments from Justin's own life, tracing his development as an artist living in New York City, that somehow all comes together in a poetic meditation on how we relate to the built environment that surrounds us. It's literary, it's critical, it's historical, and I truly can't recommend it enough. So in this episode, Justin and I talk about how this book came together. We talk about the process of writing and researching it. We talk about how he developed this writing style and what he hoped to achieve with the book and how he worked through including so much about his own life in the book. We talk about how it both enters into and subverts what we think of as an architecture book or even a book of design history. And we also talk about how this fits into Justin's larger body of work, how studying architecture helped him develop his art studio practice, and where he sees this type of work going forward. If you like the show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans. They give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, transcripts, and exclusive bonus interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details and to sign up. Thanks so much for your support. Thanks for listening. And here is my conversation with Justin Beal. You released this book, Sandfuture, which is, I told you this in an email, is one of the kind of most interesting architecture and design books that I've read this year, maybe ever. I loved it. I think it's a great book. And I sometimes struggle with describing it to people. I'm kind of telling everybody to read this book, and I'm curious how you describe it. When you talk about Sandfuture, what do you say that this book is?
Well, thank you for saying that. But I struggle with it too. It's been one of the great challenges of putting this book out into the world because I think it's very easy to describe it as a book about Minoru Yamasaki, which it is. And I think that's a very easy idea for people to kind of grasp. But the difficulty is that there's also a lot more going on, and only about 50% of the book is actually dedicated to the story of Yamasaki's life and his work. And so there's this whole other system of information that's more personal, that's more tangential, that deals with all these other subjects. And so it's been really a challenge to kind of encapsulate that in a quick elevator pitch. Um, and I'm still working on that language. And also because I think there's a certain set of expectations about what a book about architecture is like,
Right.
and a certain set of expectations about what a book from MIT Press is like. And I think this book is very consciously trying to push both of those envelopes.
Yeah.
Um, so uh, I don't really have a great answer to that question, but it's something that I'm still working on, and everyone who's been involved in this project is still kind of working on how to present it um, to a public, because I think
Yeah.
I joke often that the comment that I get most frequently about this book is something to the effect of, "Wow, this is so much more interesting than I thought it was going to be," or some more readable or whatever.
Yeah.
And which I totally do not take offense at, because part of my motivation in this whole project is that I've always found that the most interesting books to me about architecture are books that come from outside of the field of
Mm,
architecture, and
mm-hmm.
you know, and that for me has a lot to do with the fact that I think my experience, and I imagine other people's experience of architecture, is very personal,
Yeah.
and books that produce from within the field of architecture are by and large very impersonal,
Mm-hmm.
and 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 so I think part of what I was trying to do here was to write the kind of book about architecture that I've always wanted to read, and many of those my models and thinking about that come not from how architects write about architecture, but how other authors write about architecture, like James Salter or Donald Barthelme or Susan Sontag, all these people,
Mm-hmm.
Teju Cole, who were
Yeah.
writing about the built environment from a different perspective that seems to me so much more in line with my experience of architecture.
You basically just touched on like my next like 10 questions in there. So you set up
Sorry.
everything that I want to talk about, which is great. Um I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that. So yeah, 50% of the book is sort of about roughly 50% of the book is
It's
about
it's pretty
Yamasaki.
close. It wasn't my intention, but I did it at one point look at it quite specifically, and it's almost exactly 50-50. It's just sort of balanced out that way.
Interesting. That's really interesting. I don't know if I would have guessed that reading it actually. And so Yamasaki, for people who don't know, architect, probably most well known for the World Trade Center Twin Towers. And you're writing sort of a biography, it's sort of analytical sometimes. It's sort of a reflection on him and his work, but then mixed in with that are these sort of memoiristic uh kind of not chapters, fragments, I guess, about you moving to New York, about your own education, about your own work, about your own experience encountering Yamasaki's work. And all of this is sort of jumbled together. It would be very easy to write this book with a series of chapters that are about Yamasaki, that maybe are interspersed with chapters about your work. And I'm interested in the structure of this, kind of writing this as fragments. There are no chapters. It's this kind of continuous narrative that's broken up and interspersed with these sort of different positions that you take. How did you think about that, and how did you arrive at that as the way to tell these stories?
All right. So the structure of this book is, as you say, there are these kind of jumps between
Right.
different subject matter. So you spend part of the time with Yamasaki and his story, which kind of unfolds in more or less chronological order over the course of the book. And then there are these cut into that are these bits of more personal narrative, and then sort of digressions on other subjects. And I think that structure was kind of always part of this project.
Mm,
I didn't want to write a kind of traditional biography of Yamasaki. I just felt like I wasn't really the right person to do that.
mhm.
Um, and, and my instinct from the beginning had always been that I needed to write this in a kind of very specific way, where I was pulling different pieces of information together and kind of that might not logically fit together immediately, but that all kind of comprise part of a larger story. And there was a moment, when there were a couple kind of key moments in that process. And the first was uh, when I had decided to kind of start working on this book and decided that it was going to be about Yamasaki. I was quite sure at that time that I was working on what would be the first English language book about Yamasaki in 40 years, and I was
Right.
quite um, pleased with myself for kind of coming up with that idea. And when I was 2 years into the process of writing, I was told very gently by a friend that there was another book about Yamasaki in the works, and that it was quite a bit further ahead than mine. And that sort of sent me personally into into a bit of a tailspin.
Right.
because I had just sort of walked away from this other career and taken this huge risk to write this book, and now somebody else was doing it. But pretty quickly I recognized that it was one of those rare moments where like a project kind of tells you what it wants to be, and that
Mm,
this other book, which was written by um, a guy called Dale Allen Geyer, who's since
mhm.
become a friend, was published by Yale. And it's a great book. It's exactly the kind of comprehensive monograph that needs to exist for students and for scholars to kind of to have a complete view of Yamasaki's work. And the fact that it exists really kind of took this burden
I
off of
see.
my shoulders of fully representing all of Yamasaki's work, accounting for every building, accounting for every critical opinion. And instead, it sort of liberated me to allow these other parts, other ideas to come into the book and have it be sort of more about my personal, uh, more, subjective view of Yamasaki's place in history.
I have two questions that are may or may not be related. I'm curious about when you kind of heard that this other person was working on this book, and you felt deflated, and that this book is that comprehensive, kind of book. Is that Was that ever the book that you actually wanted to write? Like, did you think being the first that you had to do that, or did you always have this sense that this book you were going to write was more personal? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I know.
Okay.
I know exactly what you mean. I can't say that I can't really answer that question with confidence because I don't think I
Right.
knew at that point exactly what I was doing.
Okay.
Um, I realized I knew that had sort of I felt very strongly that there was something in these pieces of information that I was pulling together, and yeah.
Yes. Okay. So that's my next question then, which is what was it about Yamasaki that drew you in, that caused you? And I want to talk about your other work, a bit later, but that caused you to kind of step away from this work that you were doing to focus on this, not having ever written a architectural biography before. What can you just talk about that pull? What was it that kind of said like I need to do something with this man?
Well, it wasn't originally him.
Oh, interesting.
And so when I first had this idea of stepping away from the studio practice that I'd had leading up to the point when I began this book, I had it began with me giving myself a year to kind of work on a writing project, and it wasn't
Mm,
entirely clear to me what that project was going to be. But the initial sort of center of that focus was on sick building syndrome, which still
mm,
remains part of the book.
mhm,
And that kind of, in this very circuitous way, kind of led me to thinking about architects who had struggled with chronic illness, which led me actually
mhm,
first to Stornley Cracklight, who's the protagonist of Peter Greenaway's film Belly of an Architect, and who finds out that he has stomach cancer in the over the course of the film, and then strangely back to Yamasaki, who I've always been really interested in. And I can talk about why, but and Yamasaki also struggled with, uh, you know, he had ulcers, and then eventually had stomach cancer himself. And so in this very weird way, I kind of got back to
mm,
Yamasaki, and then I looked more closely at him than I ever had before. I'd always been interested in him primarily because I had an undergraduate degree in architecture, and immediately after I graduated from college, I moved into an apartment that was 2 blocks below the World Trade Center, and I only lived there for 3 or 4 weeks because it was the summer of 2001. But
mhm,
but I remember thinking at the time, I remember standing underneath the World Trade Center towers, which were such gorgeous
mhm,
objects,
mhm,
and thinking how strange it was that I had just completed this undergraduate degree in architecture and I had no idea who designed these two buildings.
mm,
And you know, gradually over the course of 20 years, I connected Yamasaki back to buildings like the Eastern Airlines Terminal in Boston, or Robertson Hall at Princeton, or the Century City in Los Angeles, and of course the period I go, and all of
Hmm.
these other things. As I returned, kind of looking at him more closely, uh, I just realized how fascinating his story was, both personally and
Right.
architecturally, and how strange it was that no one had ever really explained it to me.
Hmm.
And so the that's what kind of really drew me in and shifted the center of this project to him.
When you found out that somebody else was working on this book, and you said earlier in this conversation you could write the book that you wanted to write, and I'm wondering if you can talk about that when you kind of realized, I'm not writing the comprehensive biography, somebody else is doing that, this can be something wholly new. How did you kind of decide to bring in your own life into this in ways that are very directly related to Yamasaki, in ways that are, tangentially, in ways that, as someone who, this is the first time we're talking, seem like they have no relationship to? How did you kind of think about how these two stories could be woven together? How did that kind of develop?
It developed very slowly, and I was very reluctant to include the more personal parts of the book
Mm,
at first, uh, not because of any trepidation about oversharing, just because I was like, why would anyone be interested in this? And is it, um, why would I
right, right, right.
juxtapose
I
my
get it.
life to this extraordinary other life? And I think that, um, this kind of goes back to that question of writing the kind of book about architecture that I've always wanted to read, which sort of does somehow account for your personal experience
Mm,
of the built environment. And the only way to kind of really account for that was to put myself into the book in some way. And um and I found, as a writer, I found that incredibly hard to do.
mm,
um I felt sort of allergic to writing about myself in the first person,
yeah.
and actually had to write most of that in the third person to get it out, and then go back after the fact and
Oh,
change
that's
it
really
into the first
interesting.
person, because I just, yeah, there was I don't know if it was kind of modesty or self-consciousness, or something, but
I mean,
um
and I noticed also, and we can cut this out if this is not public information, but it seems like you changed names of family, and your child and your partner are very present in the book, but that's not their real names, it seems like.
yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I think it's an interesting, I mean, it's a question that I get a lot, and the answer is not particularly complicated. I think my wife Jane and my daughter Rosie, who are Nina and Zoe in the book, they're both their own women
Right,
who
right.
exist in the world and have their own story, and I felt that they deserved a measure of privacy, even if
Makes sense.
anyone who knows me knows exactly who they are. I just wanted to create a little bit of distance. It's not, it's not a it's not done in order to take kind of license to kind of push things into fiction, because it's, everything is based in fact, but it just felt important in the case of those two that they, have one degree of removal from the text.
Right. And I did not read it as fiction or, moving away from memoir in any way, but I did wonder if there was this kind of self-consciousness about the personal, and if that was part of it. So it's interesting. Can you talk more about writing it in the third person first? Was How was that helpful in kind of getting out your side of this story?
It just allowed me to, uh, I don't, I mean, it's such a silly grammatical trick, but
Right.
it allowed me to feel just enough distance to feel like I was kind of looking back at myself
Hmm.
from the outside. Um,
Hmm.
I'm sure people who have more experience writing this way have better ways of articulating this, but I just didn't. I felt less self conscious writing that way. Yeah.
I asked that question purely selfishly as somebody who has has written a lot from a more position as the critic or the journalist, and have an interest in writing from a more kind of personal place, and that it is a very deep struggle for me to do that. And it's interesting to hear that, and I think that's why I came to your book and liked your book so much, is because it did talk about these subjects that I'm very interested in from a very sort of personal place. And so I'm kind of interested in that process. That's why I keep asking you kind of these like process questions.
No, it's fine.
Um,
I mean, they're great questions.
I mean, I don't want to give away anything from the book because I do want people to read it, but I was struck. The book opens with Hurricane Sandy and being in New York during Hurricane Sandy, of which I was also, and so I was immediately kind of drawn in that way. But I was kind of struck. I was reading the book trying to figure out kind of what you were just talking about. It's like, why are these two stories together? Why do I care so much about Justin's story, who is somebody who I don't know, but I can't seem to put this book down. And then there's this moment that's later in the book that I would have imagined, where you say that you lived in Lower Manhattan and that you were in New York on September 11th and that you photographed the towers. And that was a very sort of revelatory moment. And I'm curious about the decision to kind of withhold that information. Um, and then kind of the reveal of that, and this kind of, much deeper personal connection than it is immediately led on.
Yeah, so the role of 9/11 in this story is um, one that I spent a lot of time thinking about,
Mm,
and I wrote there was at one point a lot more of the book that was about
mm,
uh, the time after 9/11,
mhm,
and there were sort of two concerns I had with that. One is that something like 9/11, if you put too if there's too much of it in a book, it doesn't really take very much at all. It becomes a book about that, right?
exactly. I get it.
And I was very I really didn't want that to be what this book is. And both because too much ink has already been spilled on that topic, and also because it's been the event through which so much of the writing about Yamasaki
Right.
had been framed, right? So it was very important to me to kind of cut that down to a minimum. So there are actually only
Mm,
two, they're the only scenes that relate directly to 9/11 are the actual morning of, and then this scene when I returned to the
right.
apartment a week
Right.
later to get some stuff. And also, similarly, the choice to not include that photograph in the book for the same reason is that if you put a 9/11 photograph in, it just it has this way of kind of sucking all the rest of the air out of the room. And one of the great challenges with writing about Yamasaki is how do you maintain an equilibrium between the really extraordinary fact that this one man designed two major projects, the World Trade Center and Period Igo, that were both blown up
Yeah.
on television,
Yeah.
which is just,
Yeah.
mind-boggling. But how do you also kind of hold that in balance with the fact that those two projects were probably the two least representative of his practice
Mm,
that he ever made, and
mhm.
also that they were only two projects in a really kind of prolific, hugely influential career. So you have to kind of let both of those things coexist, and it's very easy to let too much weight fall on the 9/11. And so I was doing everything I could, because you don't have to, it's present even in its absence, right?
Right, right.
um
That's exactly what I was gonna say, because you're right, and I was impressed by that withholding and how little you actually spend talking about it, yet it does hang over the book, and not of anything you did or didn't do. It's just there. And
mhm.
I was you mentioned Teju Cole earlier, who's a favorite writer of mine also, and I think he's sort of a master at um kind of diverting your gaze to let the thing just kind of sit there, in the background, but not actually ever say it. But it's kind of hanging there, and that's kind of I'm realizing this as you're talking. That's what makes your book so powerful. Also, is that it's this very small part, but it's still just it's there. I don't know. I'm not saying
Yeah, well, I
anything
mean,
new, but
I think Tisha Cole's book Open City
mhm,
and Joseph O'Neill's book Netherland are probably the two best books about New York after 9/11, right?
mhm, mhm,
And for me, and they were both very important books for me. As I was sort of thinking about how to
mm,
approach my own book, and both of them, the 9/11 exists, but
right, right,
it's barely mentioned. You don't have to
right,
mention it. It's in the atmosphere of the book if you write the book right. So,
right, right. How did how did writing this book, and you write about spending time in the archives, visiting these buildings, kind of immersing yourself in his life. How did this change how you thought about Yamasaki?
mm. I mean, the process of researching somebody in such depth is really quite an intimate experience. You get to know a lot of these details about the person, but at the same time, he was quite withholding
Mm,
in terms of personal information, at least in what remains in the archive. And so, what I was continually impressed by is the way in which he was able to kind of accomplish the work
mm,
that he did under extraordinarily adverse circumstances. Um, this point that I talk about in the book when he and his wife Terry get married on Friday, December 5th in 1941. They spent the night dancing on the roof of the Hotel Astor, and then Sunday morning is Pearl Harbor,
right,
and everything radically kind of shifts beneath their feet. And
right.
Yamasaki is working for Shreve Lamb and Harmon on a massive military installation while simultaneously trying to help his parents leave Seattle so they won't be sent to the internment camp. And just to imagine the this experience of having your parents living on the floor of your apartment so they don't get sent to an internment camp while you're working for the government that considers your family an enemy combatant is just it's almost impossible for me to kind of wrap my brain around that. And so I developed an enormous admiration for his ability to kind of continue to persevere through those
Mm,
circumstances and to be as prolific and successful as he was, and at the same time, as uh, as an architect, he there he's unique among architects in terms of willingness to admit his mistakes, right?
mm,
And that
mhm,
and his career is marked by these kind of spectacular successes and spectacular failures. And he designed some great buildings, and he designed some that he says it himself. He says it at one point, I designed some real dogs. And and I think that he in that way I find him to be a very sympathetic figure, because so much of the story that we always hear about architecture is a kind of this really paper thin heroic story.
mhm, yeah,
And so much of what interests me about the process of making things, objects, buildings, books, whatever you're putting it out into the world, is how fraught that is, and how much failure there is in it, and how
mhm,
much insecurity there is in it. And when you start to look at his life more closely, you can kind of feel that, and you can feel it weighing on him, and you can feel how much it means to him in this way that you don't get when you're looking at this, um, when you're consuming the kind of architectural narrative that's most often presented to us, right? Which is
right,
of just
right.
like heroic success.
Right. This is the last question I think that I have about the book, and I want to kind of then talk about how this fits into your work more generally. But you started at the beginning kind of talking about wanting to write a book about architecture that was pushing up against what we expect about an architecture book. I'm very curious that this was a book published by MIT Press, when I think this is a very unusual book for them. And I'm kind of curious. I'm struggling to articulate this question. I'm curious kind of how writing this, how you thought about sort of both entering into an established architectural discourse, and then also like how you wanted to break away from it. You know what you mean?
Hmm.
Like, you're very much part of a larger dialogue now, but this also feels like something wholly different. How did you kind of think about, where this book sits in sort of like architecture writing?
I was,
You know what I mean? You know what I mean? That's
I
a
mean,
big question, but
yeah, sure, I know what you mean. I was thinking more about how on earth am I going to get this to be published, right?
right,
I
right,
don't.
right,
Let's not put the cart before the horse here.
right,
But
right,
I think that uh, I was trying to hold both of those things in balance, right? And I think that in many ways, um, this book belongs as much to the sort of genre uh, of kind of lonely man wandering the streets of Manhattan as it
right,
does to
yeah.
the genre of architecture, right? And I say that slightly tongue in cheek, but
Hmm.
um, there that is a very established history, and a lot of the books that I was thinking about a lot before I began writing it come from that sort of space, right? I mentioned Netherland and Open
Hmm.
City, but also 10/4 by Ben Lerner, or
Yeah,
Staten Island by Tom McCarthy,
yeah.
um, which of course then connects to Here's New York by E.B. White, or
Hmm.
it's this long-standing kind of
Yeah,
tradition.
you're helping me understand why I loved your book so much, because you're just naming all my favorite books now too. So
Well, I mean, yeah,
yeah,
and so um, here we are, two middle-aged men talking about
right,
middle-aged men wandering the streets of New York.
right,
But
right. It all makes sense
um,
now.
it is a rich literary tradition. Uh, so I don't think the books that made me feel like I could take this project on were not architecture books. And then I think I got, but architecture is, has been an odd way the center of focus of my work for the last 20 years, even though almost all of that work has been outside of the field of architecture. So
Hmm.
I felt, and with Yamasaki at the center, this is a book that very much belongs in that sort of architectural space. So it was trying to kind of bring those things together. And I mean, I was extraordinarily lucky in this process to have had the editor that I had, Tom Weaver, who I think really understood what I was trying to do, and understood that it was unlike the MIT Press book that you might imagine,
Right.
but also could fit in within that umbrella. And that was something that was about which there was a lot of conversation, and
Yeah.
there also, it's not just the style and the structure of this book. There's also other formatting things. This book doesn't have a bibliography. It doesn't
Right.
have footnotes. It doesn't have a title that is this is the subject of the book, colon, this
Right.
is the thesis of the book.
Right.
um, and so in many key ways, it's a kind of working against some of the traditions of academic publishing, um, but which I like,
Yeah.
and I think that I like to think that I adhered to the sort of academic rigor and intellectual kind of standards of an academic press without having to conform to the format.
You just said something that I want to come back to. You said that your work has been architectural over the last 20 years, even though it's been outside of architecture. And I want to talk about that a little bit. You studied architecture at Yale. And I saw that you also went through the Whitney ISP Independent Study Program, studied at
Yeah.
University of Southern California. I'm curious about your interest in architecture and kind of studying architecture at Yale. Were you thinking you were going to be an architect? Was that sort of the plan? And can you talk about sort of this move from studying architecture and moving into a more sort of fine art world?
Yeah, sure. I don't think the plan was ever to be an architect.
Mm,
I really liked, I still like the kind of pedagogical model of the undergraduate architecture major. I like the idea of this umbrella, which under which you can study film theory
mm,
and structural engineering, and also have a kind of hands-on studio practice.
right.
Uh, you know, that's what I wanted to do, and I did it. I think I can't really speak for my 19-year-old self, but I don't think that I was imagining a career as an architect at that point.
Okay.
I was more interested in art. It was also like the late 90s, and
Hmm.
so it was a moment in which a lot of the art that I was looking at was very concerned with architectural uh, space, right? I mean,
Hmm.
so it's
Hmm.
like it's sort of the tail end of what we would now look back on as relational aesthetics. So you're looking at artists like Dominique Gonzalez Forrester, or
Right.
Pierre Weig, or Jorge Pardo. The first job I had after I graduated from college was working for Andrea Zattel. So in this space where there was a very fertile kind of gray area between the two at that time. And I'm still really interested in that sort of as an educational model.
Yeah.
Um, but I think I had a clear sense even at that age that I didn't want to kind of go through the paces of working as an architect, and I wasn't. It's not an environment where I would really thrive. I think I've always
Uh,
been slightly more independent, and and so I think that in the back of my head I was working towards making art, but I was interested in kind of doing it with this architectural education.
how do you think that architectural education influenced your work in the art world? Basically, I'm just asking you to talk more about kind of your interest in the pedagogical model. But how do you think that influenced both how you thought about the art you were making, and then how that was kind of positioned and lived in the world?
Well, I talk about this a bit, and there's a passage in the book where this comes up, and where I talk about how I had the sort of good fortune of entering the art world at a time when
Right.
people were really interested in design, and so uh, the, the that was um, there. I'm sure there are other times where people might have entered the art world as a poet or as a dancer when those things were kind of more in fashion, and it just happened to be
Mm,
this curiosity at the moment, which I think I imagine made certain things easier for me. I think it allowed me, having not gone through a kind of traditional art school program, it allowed me to take a slightly different approach to a studio practice because I had never really, you know, learned how to paint a painting or to make a sculpture. I kind of had this other set of skills and ways of thinking that I could bring to bear on the work that I was making. None of not That's not terribly unusual. I think a lot of the most interesting artists often come from with outside of that art school structure. But I think it informed a lot about the way that I think. And it's funny, a lot of this book actually was developed on pinned up on a wall, and
mm,
and it's funny looking at it now how much the way that I pinned the book up on the wall is kind of this perfect recreation of that classic architecture school pinup,
right.
um, which I hadn't even thought of until after the fact. But thinking on two
Yeah.
dimensional vertical
Yeah.
space like that is such a um, method of architecture education.
How did writing kind of fit in here? You'd mentioned earlier that you kind of had made this decision that you were going to take a year to write something. Had you always been writing throughout this kind of art practice, or how does that connect
Yeah.
to this work?
Well, writing had always been part of what I was doing. I have no formal education as a writer, really, but I grew up with a writer. My mother's a poet,
Hmm,
and it's always been a useful way for me to kind of work through what I'm
right.
thinking about. The the sort of lead up, and I think this is relevant to what you're asking to this project, that was finding myself at a point in my career as an artist where I had, I was doing everything that I was supposed to be doing. I think I was having what could fairly be described as a sort of fine career as an artist,
Mm, mhm,
and but I was very conscious somehow of the fact that there were all these people who were 10 years further along in the process than I was, who were really struggling. And
mm,
there's so much kind of speculative energy in the art world now, and so much excitement about what's new, that it's relatively easy to get a lot of attention when you're just starting out, and then there's this kind of natural dip,
right.
and I was always sort of watching these people who were older than me as they kind of encountered that doldrums period, and it was hard to kind of discern exactly what it all meant. But what was clear to me from watching other people was that the people who had continued to do the same thing that they were doing over and over again
Mhm,
were really unhappy, and the
yeah.
people who had figured out some way to make a pivot within their practice uh, were the ones who were thriving. And so
Mm,
it was with that idea in mind that, quite out of the blue, I found myself in this experience where this gallery that was owned by uh, Jane or Nina was flooded horribly in Hurricane Sandy, and I was pulling all these sculptures, objects, paintings, photographs that were made by friends of mine
right.
out of the basement, and just found myself thinking, God, this is such an insane way of communicating with the world, like making these big,
Mm,
cumbersome things that you know take up so much space and are so hard to make. And that was really what kind of solidified in my mind this idea that maybe the next thing for me was going to be something that was more
huh,
immaterial.
yeah.
And that kind of gave me the idea to think about this writing project. I still, at that time, I still had kind of 2 years of commitments to finish work for shows or whatever. So I didn't jump right into the writing, but that's where the sort of germ of the idea was, to try and explore what I was thinking about in a less material way. Um,
Do you see the book and the writing process and putting this book together as related to your art practice and the art that you were doing? How do you see those as connecting?
I see them as totally related. I see them
Mm,
as the same thing. And from the just from the day-to-day perspective, I go to the same studio in the morning, and I work in the same space, and I'm thinking about the same things. And so on one level, it feels to me uh, like an incredibly logical extension of the practice that preceded it, and all part of a whole.
mhm,
I know the on the outside people don't see it that way, and I think that, of course, I understand that. At a certain level, I feel like you start working on a project and you don't know necessarily if the best way to realize it is as a series of sculptures, or as a photograph, or as a book, right? And so
right.
at one level, I think this is a project that just needed to take the form of a book. Of course, I've spent now 5 years working on that book, and have been forced kind of reluctantly to self-identify as a writer. And so so um, the world may not see it the same way, but I think in the long term, my hope is that with decades of retrospect, looking back, it will all feel like part of a kind of cohesive practice.
Yeah. You just said you spent 5 years working on this. It's out now. You're obviously doing press for it. What's next for you? Where do you see this work, kind of going forward? What are you thinking about now? I'm kind of curious, when you wrap up a project like this, how you think about what comes next.
Yeah. Well, you have to find time to think about it. I think that the one of the things that very naively I hadn't anticipated as the author of a book was just how much time goes into
Yeah.
the the months after it's published, which has been actually really fun, and I've learned a lot, both about the book and about myself doing all of it. So that's great, but I haven't had a ton of time to concentrate on what's next. I think that there will be another book.
Mm.
I have some ideas about what form that might take, but I'm not sure I'm totally ready to jump right into it. So I've been thinking about making some objects and kind of returning to that side of the studio practice a bit as well, and kind of figuring a way out for those two things to coexist.
Yeah.
But
I love that. I think that's a good way to end. So I'm going to ask you my last question, which I use to end all of these. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
Oh, right. Right now I'm reading Colson Whitehead's book, Harlem Shuffle. And I'm also reading this really extraordinary little book about Sarah Penn and her store Knob Kerry that was in the East Village. It's this kind of oral history that was compiled by a woman called Svetlana Kito as part of a show that was at the Sculpture Center. But it's funny. I feel like there were so many projects kind of cooking during COVID that there's all these books are now coming out that I'm excited to read. So I feel like I just got Teju Cole's new book, Keller Easterling's new book, Tom McCarthy's new book. I feel like there's a lot to read. But
you and me both. I just finished Teju Cole's new book. Tom McCarthy's is on my list also, and Keller's too. I love Keller.
Yep.
Justin, like I said, I loved your book. It's one of my favorite books that I read this year. And unlike any other kind of architecture focused book that I've read, I hope you do write another one, and I hope more people write books that are like your book, if that's a weird thing to say. And I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for doing this.
So did I. Thank you, Jarrett, and thank you for having me on the show.
This episode was recorded on November 17th, 2021. Our theme music is by Yanni Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.